The time, Sunday morning in the summer of 1976. The place, a small country church outside of Charlotte, North Carolina. The situation, a young 20-something man stood in front of a congregation of around 100 people to preach his first sermon before heading off to seminary in Kentucky. You see, his great uncle had arranged for the young man to preach in his church, where he served as an interim minister. And the young man chose to preach on the love chapter, 1 Corinthians 13. After all, what church did not need to hear a sermon about loving one another? Kumbaya. Well, in preparation for the sermon, he spent hours writing everything he knew about love, which I must say was written without a great deal of experience, a rather naive understanding of love. The sanctuary apparently had no air conditioning, and the sweat came pouring down his face, and unfortunately, he had written about 14 pages of script, all written in blue flare. By the time he sat down, 30 minutes had gone by, and words on the page were a streaming mess. Needless to say, that story is about me, and fortunately for you, I've learned that sermons do not have to last 30 minutes. And I have hopefully expanded my knowledge about love, but we will see. In the passage from Mark this morning, we discover an encounter between Jesus and a scribe who appeared to be intrigued by some of the conversations between the scribes and Jesus. You could say the scribe noted truth in the words of Jesus and wanted to know more about his teachings. He appeared to be a genuine seeker with no air of hostility. Perhaps the scribe had questions about his own faith, about his own religion, and found himself searching for answers. For in early Judaism, there had been a great dispute about how to rank the 613 commandments. Not 10, 613. 248 of them were positive ones, and 365 were prohibitions. So the scribes asked him, which commandment is the first of all? It's a good question. Jesus responded with the Jewish Shema, which has been described as perhaps as close as one can get to a Jewish confession of faith. It was a morning prayer for every good Jew from at least the 2nd century BC. So Jesus said, the first commandment is this: Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And then Jesus adds these words, which came from Leviticus, which say, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Sounds pretty simple, does it not? Love God, neighbor, and self. Good. Sermon over. I can have a seat. But wait a minute, is it that simple? Are we missing something? If Jesus can have a constructive dialogue with a scribe about belief, then it seems like anything may have been possible. Karl Barth tells us that love is the essence of Christian living. And I would say that most religions that I know also emphasize love for one another. Makes you wonder sometimes why we have such a difficult time getting along with each other. Well, where do we begin to miss the point about loving one another? When do we cut off dialogue with those we disagree? And what does it mean to love God with all our heart, understanding, and strength? In other words, love God completely. Too often we think in the abstract. Of course we love God. Of course we believe in God. Of course we trust in God. But do we really? Some words are easy to say. They can roll out of our memory banks without truly understanding what we actually are saying and believing. For example, when tragedy enters our lives, whether it is the death of a family member who died far too early, when it is children killing other children, or when it is the deaths of 11 members of a congregation worshiping in a peaceful synagogue, what is our reaction? What do we believe about God then? Where is that loving God who is walking beside us day by day? A quote I've used at several funerals comes from my theology professor, Frank Tupper, who wrote these words about death following the death of his wife. He said, "Sometimes when God cannot do anything for you, God sits on the curb and cries with you, when that's all God can do." Yes, I think it is possible to love God in the midst of great loss, but that does not stop us from questioning why. But God is big enough to handle all of our questions. So what does it mean to say we love God? Does it mean as long as we believe God thinks the way we do, we can believe? How do we handle the fragility of love? The word translated as love in our passage comes today from the Greek word agape. There are other Greek words that have been translated into English as love, which deal with brotherly love and sexual love, but agape love is very different. It refers to the highest form of love, unconditional love, universal love that transcends all other love. We are called by the Jewish scriptures and by Jesus to have agape love, unconditional love toward God. Where we miss the point of loving God is when we create God in our own image. For example, if we believe we can abuse the creation of nature through massive, unchecked pollution, do we truly love God? If we believe we can ignore those in need around us with little interest in caring for the welfare of all God's creations, do we truly love God? Or do we limit or withhold our love for others through words we say or actions we take? As we heard earlier, we have also been taught through religious writings that we are to love our neighbors as ourselves. We have heard countless sermons over our lifetimes about who is our neighbor. The answer comes to us through the story of the Good Samaritan, where we are encouraged to see all persons as our neighbors, the poor, the rich, the immigrants, people of all colors, all nationalities, all religions, and the list goes on and on. I'm grateful that our church covenant says, we affirm that we are open to all and closed to none. That's a good first step. Venerable Bede wrote these words about loving God and neighbor when he said, "Neither of these two kinds of loves is capable of being perfect without the other, because God cannot be loved apart from our neighbor, nor our neighbor apart from God." In the first church that I served out of seminary, after I graduated from seminary, I had a young man who became part of a church that his parents said resembled a cult. They were very concerned about how much their son had changed over the past few months. And later I learned that the young man had given away his expensive watch to a member of this new community of faith because the person needed a watch to tell what time it was so he would not be late for his job. Another time he gave away his car to someone he did not have transportation. Now, truthfully, does that sound strange? Conventional thinking says yes, while the teachings of Jesus encourage us to help our neighbors, to even help strangers. Sometimes it is easier to ignore the teachings of Jesus and just use our plain old common sense. However, we might see the world a little bit differently if we would open our minds and hearts to new ways of thinking and acting. Imagine if we considered a neighbor as someone who lives beyond simply a few blocks from us. Imagine if we expanded and focused our view of neighbor, of community, to include all children, all youth, families, adults of all ages, across the street and across town. But that requires change. And who here is comfortable with change? It is too easy to ask this about change. What is in it for me? Or how will the change hurt me? In December, we open up our church facilities to welcome our neighbors who are experiencing homelessness. Each Saturday night through March, we provide warm meals, a bed, a shower, and a welcoming conversation with many volunteers. Room in the Inn, created out of the Urban Ministry Center, began this ministry 23 years ago as we opened our doors to our guests. And when I've served through Room in the Inn, the presence of God's love can be experienced in the flesh. I am convinced that if we learn to put ourselves in the shoes of those going through difficult times in their lives, our responses to those in need would be swift and bold. The scriptures taught by Jesus also taught us to love ourselves. And sometimes that can be difficult for us, for we can view ourselves as unworthy. Sometimes we can love ourselves in a self-absorbed way, but either extreme can be painful and hurtful. Augustine said this about love: a man or a woman who loves God is not wrong in loving himself or herself. Too many people fall into the trap of not loving themselves. And you know, it is so difficult to see people speak critically of others. I just wonder if it could be such anger is fueled by low self-esteem or not really feeling loved by God. It is sad to observe people who obsess about having the perfect body, wearing the right brand of clothing, portraying the perfect image, when that is part of living a myth. God created all our bodies, and God created us out of God's deep love for each one of us. Now, can we ever be perfect? No. Even so, God loves us unconditionally with agape love. And that does not mean that anything goes. It does mean that God will be there in our lives to help us through each day, for we are all beloved children of God. Today is Memorial Sunday, a time when we honor those in our community of faith who have died during this past year. I've had the honor of walking with many of you through the deaths of those close to you. I've learned about their lives, the impacts that they had upon you, your family, and friends. And those good memories can never be taken away from you. Well, here are some of the inspiring traits that were spoken at the individual memorial services throughout the year. Generosity, kindness, devotion to family, faithful through actions, loving wife, husband, father, mother, sister, brother, grandparent, gave back to the community. A searcher, a seeker of truth, brought beauty into the world, never met a stranger, compassionate, encourager, filled with integrity, public servant, cared for the disadvantaged, open-hearted, perseverant, caring, gracious, humility, dedication to social justice, inclusive, a peacemaker. Sometimes my wish is to simply embody 3 or 4 of those traits. Just hearing the list of traits challenges me every day to be a better person. Well, what a legacy has been left to us by those who have gone before us. Now, we have heard today, love God, neighbor, and self. And those are the commandments we are called to follow. Will we always do the right thing? Of course not. But that should not stop us from trying. Are we called to care for our neighbors? Yes. Should we keep our eyes and minds open so we can learn how we can recognize and interrupt social structures and systems where we live, where we may work, in the groups with whom we interact, in our families that oppress and marginalize others? Yes. Should we offer our listening ears to those who have experienced grief and great pain in their lives? Yes. Should we be careful with the words we choose to use when we talk about others? Of course, for words do matter. And I want to repeat that. Words do matter. Can or will we embody God's abundant love for us so that we can make a difference in the lives of others? Is that too naive a statement? I truly hope not. Amen.